In May 1915, a warning appeared in newspapers across the United States. It was direct, cold, and unsettling. The German government warned that any ships sailing toward the British Isles could be attacked by German war submarines. And within that warning was a name many passengers completely ignored: Lusitania. That same week, hundreds of people boarded the massive ocean liner believing they were stepping onto one of the fastest and most luxurious ships in the world. Many had seen the German warning printed in the newspaper. Others had heard rumors about submarines in the Atlantic. But few truly believed that a passenger liner could be sunk. The Lusitania was considered too fast, too large, too famous, and operated by one of the most respected shipping companies in the world. Yet while passengers walked along the ship's elegant decks, a brutal war was already unfolding across the ocean. And by the spring of 1915, German submarines were beginning to change the rules of naval warfare. The RMS Lusitania departed from New York on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool, England. On board were nearly 2,000 people, including passengers and crew. There were businessmen, families, tourists, artists, engineers, and American citizens traveling to Europe during the middle of World War I. For many of them, it was simply another Atlantic crossing. But the world had already changed. World War I had been raging since 1914, and the Atlantic Ocean had become an invisible battlefield. Merchant ships, cargo vessels, and military transports were being hunted by a new weapon that was beginning to terrify navies around the world: the war submarine. The Germans called these vessels U-boats, short for Unterseeboot, meaning undersea boat. These machines could remain hidden beneath the surface for long periods and attack enemy ships without warning. For the German government, ships supplying Great Britain were legitimate targets. But there was a problem. Many of those ships also carried civilian passengers. Even so, Germany decided to adopt an aggressive strategy of submarine warfare. And it was within this context that the warning appeared in American newspapers. On the morning of May 1, 1915, as passengers prepared to board the Lusitania in New York, many of them opened the day's newspapers to follow the news of the war spreading across Europe. Among articles about battles and military movements, there was a small notice that caught attention. It was not an advertisement. It was an official warning. Published by the Imperial German Embassy, the statement directly warned anyone considering travel to the war zone around the British Isles. The notice stated that vessels sailing in those waters were liable to destruction by German naval forces. It also made it clear that passengers who chose to travel on such ships would do so at their own risk. The warning appeared in several major newspapers, sometimes printed right next to advertisements from the Cunard Line, which was promoting the voyage of the Lusitania departing that very day. It was an almost surreal coincidence. On one side of the page, a warning about German submarines destroying ships. On the other, a promotional advertisement for one of the largest ocean liners in the world, leaving port that same morning. Many passengers saw the warning. Some even discussed it. But most simply did not take it seriously. The Lusitania was already a legendary ship. Since its launch in 1907, it had become a symbol of speed, luxury, and the power of British naval engineering. For years it had been one of the fastest ships on the Atlantic, capable of crossing the ocean in less than 5 days. There was also a widespread belief among passengers and crews of ocean liners that submarines would not attack large civilian vessels. At that time, traditional rules of naval warfare still existed, requiring merchant ships to be stopped and inspected before being sunk. The idea that a submarine would simply torpedo a passenger ship full of civilians seemed absurd to many people. There was also another important factor. The Lusitania was fast. Extremely fast. With a maximum speed close to 25 knots, many experts believed the ship was almost impossible for the submarines of that era to hit. A U-boat had to carefully position itself to fire a torpedo, and striking a fast-moving liner was far from easy. For most people on board, the German warning felt more like an attempt to intimidate travelers than a real threat. And so, on that sunny Saturday morning in New York, the Lusitania began its crossing. Passengers walked along the decks watching the Statue of Liberty as the massive liner slowly left the harbor. Some were excited about the journey. Others discussed the news of the war. But almost no one imagined that the warning printed in that newspaper was about to become one of the most tragic warnings in maritime history. As the Lusitania crossed the Atlantic toward Europe, a German submarine was already patrolling the waters near the coast of Ireland. As the Lusitania advanced across the Atlantic toward Europe, the war at sea continued in silence and with relentless intensity. German submarines patrolled the shipping routes near the British Isles, searching for any vessel that might be transporting supplies to the United Kingdom. Germany believed that cutting these supply routes could weaken Britain's ability to continue fighting the war. Among these submarines was U-20, commanded by Captain Walter Schwieger. The U-20 had departed a few days earlier on a patrol mission in the Atlantic. Like many other German submarines during that period of the war, its mission was simple and brutal: locate ships that could support the British war effort and destroy them. Submarines of that era were impressive machines, but they were also extremely limited. They spent much of their time traveling on the surface to conserve energy and only submerged when it was necessary to attack or hide. Inside, conditions were cramped, hot, and filled with the smell of oil and fuel. Even so, these vessels were completely changing the way wars were fought at sea. A single torpedo could destroy an entire ship. And unlike large warships, submarines could attack without warning. In the days following the Lusitania's departure from New York, the ship crossed the Atlantic with relative calm. On board, the routine of the voyage continued almost as if it were peacetime. Passengers walked along the decks. Some read newspapers or discussed the war in Europe. Others attended elegant dinners in the ship's luxurious dining halls. The Lusitania remained one of the most sophisticated ships in the world. Its dining rooms were decorated with refined wood panels, elegant chandeliers illuminated the corridors, and the crew maintained impeccable service, exactly as expected from a transatlantic liner of the Cunard Line. But while this seemingly peaceful routine unfolded on board, reports of German submarines continued to reach British intelligence services. The waters near Ireland were becoming increasingly dangerous. Merchant ships had been attacked. Some had already been sunk. Messages began circulating warning captains of vessels approaching the British coast to increase vigilance. The captain of the Lusitania, William Thomas Turner, also received warnings about submarine activity in the region. Such warnings were not unusual at that stage of the war. Many captains crossing the Atlantic received similar reports and adjusted their routes or increased their level of caution while navigating. Even so, the Lusitania continued moving toward Ireland. The ship was still hundreds of kilometers from Liverpool, but within a few days it would enter one of the most dangerous areas of the Atlantic during the war. And somewhere beneath those same waters, U-20 continued its silent patrol. In the first days of May 1915, the Lusitania continued moving across the North Atlantic toward Ireland. The ship maintained a high speed as was typical for a transatlantic liner of its size, and the crossing seemed to be proceeding normally. For many passengers, it was still simply a luxurious Atlantic voyage, despite the war raging on the other side of the ocean. Inside the ship's salons, daily life continued. Passengers talked, walked along the decks, and followed news of the war through newspapers available on board. Some discussed the events unfolding in Europe, while others preferred to ignore the conflict entirely and simply enjoy the journey. The Lusitania still carried the reputation of being one of the fastest and safest ships in the world. But as the ship approached the waters around Ireland, the situation at sea began to change. Captain William Thomas Turner started receiving new reports about German submarine activity in the region. These warnings were sent by British authorities to vessels approaching the coast, alerting them to the presence of U-boats patrolling the commercial shipping routes. The messages advised caution. Captains were encouraged to maintain increased vigilance, avoid predictable routes, and when possible travel at higher speeds to reduce the chances of interception. However, there was an important detail. On the morning of May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was sailing near the southern coast of Ireland, approaching the area known as Old Head of Kinsale. This region marked one of the final stages of the voyage before arriving in Liverpool. Visibility that morning was not perfect. At times, there was fog, something common in the waters near the Irish coast. During part of the morning, the ship reduced its speed while passing through areas where visibility was limited. In maritime navigation, slowing down in foggy conditions is a standard safety practice. But that decision would have important consequences. As the Lusitania moved slowly toward the coastline, a German submarine was operating in that same area. It was U-20. Commander Walter Schwieger had spent days patrolling that section of the Atlantic, searching for ships that could be considered targets. The submarine had already sunk several vessels during that mission. That afternoon, Schwieger was scanning the horizon through the submarine's periscope. And then he saw something. A large silhouette on the ocean. It was an ocean liner. Through the periscope of U-20, Commander Walter Schwieger carefully observed the ship appearing on the horizon. Even from a distance, it was clear that the vessel was enormous. Its size, its funnels, and its silhouette were unmistakable. It was the Lusitania. For a German submarine commander in 1915, that kind of target was extremely valuable. The German government had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone. Ships transporting cargo to Britain could be considered part of the war effort. Although the Lusitania was primarily a passenger ship, it was also carrying cargo. Inside the ship's holds were various commercial materials destined for Britain. This fact would later be used by Germany to justify the attack. Inside the submarine, the crew began preparing. World War I submarines operated with a limited number of torpedoes. Each shot had to be calculated carefully. The position of the target, its speed, and its direction of movement were crucial factors to ensure the torpedo would strike the ship. Schwieger kept the periscope aligned as the Lusitania continued moving forward. The massive ocean liner was now at the perfect distance for an attack. Inside U-20, the torpedo was prepared. Then the order came. The torpedo was fired at 2:10 p.m. on May 7, 1915. It left the submarine's tube and began moving silently through the water toward the Lusitania. On board the ship, almost no one noticed the danger. Some passengers were walking along the deck. Others were talking or watching the coastline of Ireland, which could already be seen in the distance. Seconds later, the torpedo struck the starboard side of the ship, just below the waterline. The explosion was immediate. A massive column of water and debris shot into the air as the impact tore through the hull of the Lusitania. But something unexpected happened immediately afterward. A second, much larger explosion shook the ship. This second explosion remains one of the most debated aspects of the disaster even today. Witnesses reported that it occurred only seconds after the initial torpedo impact, dramatically increasing the damage to the ship's structure. Regardless of the exact cause of that secondary blast, the effect was devastating. The Lusitania began to list violently to one side almost immediately after the impact. Atlantic water started rushing rapidly into the ship's internal compartments. And within minutes, it became clear that the situation was far more serious than anyone on board could have imagined. The list of the Lusitania increased almost immediately after the impact. The torpedo had struck a critical area of the hull, and the secondary explosion made the damage even worse. Inside the ship, water began flooding several compartments at a rapid pace. On the upper decks, the initial shock was quickly followed by confusion. Many passengers did not immediately understand what had happened. Some only felt the impact and heard the roar of the explosion. Others saw the column of water rising beside the ship and instantly realized that something very serious had occurred. Crew members began running through the corridors shouting orders. Life jackets started to be distributed. But there was a critical problem. The Lusitania was listing very rapidly. That tilt made it extremely difficult to properly prepare and launch the lifeboats. On a ship that remains relatively stable, lifeboats can be lowered slowly and safely into the water. But when the deck is tilted, the cables and davits used to lower the boats begin operating at dangerous angles. Some lifeboats became stuck. Others were launched unevenly. In some cases, boats slammed against the ship's hull when they touched the water, overturning or breaking apart. Meanwhile, the list continued to increase. Water was advancing quickly through the internal structure of the ship. The Lusitania had not been designed with the same extensive system of watertight compartments that some later ships would have. Once water began spreading, the additional weight quickly compromised the vessel's stability. On deck, passengers tried to reach the lifeboats as the ship tilted further. Some slipped on the slanted deck. Others tried to help family members put on life jackets. Many began to realize that the ship was sinking far faster than anyone had expected. Within minutes, the bow began to drop visibly toward the water. The Lusitania was a massive ship, more than 240 meters long, yet the speed with which the ocean was overcoming it was astonishing. The tilt became so severe that simply walking on deck was nearly impossible. Passengers began sliding toward the lower side of the ship. Some were thrown directly into the sea when they lost their balance. Meanwhile, smaller vessels along the Irish coast began to notice what was happening. Fishermen and nearby ships saw the enormous silhouette of the Lusitania leaning on the horizon and started heading quickly toward the area. But everything was happening too fast. Just 18 minutes after the torpedo struck the ship, the Lusitania began to disappear beneath the waters of the Atlantic. The stern briefly lifted as the bow plunged downward. And then the enormous ocean liner vanished completely beneath the surface of the sea. Where it had stood only minutes earlier, there were now only debris, overturned lifeboats, and hundreds of people struggling in the cold waters off the coast of Ireland. When the Lusitania disappeared beneath the surface of the Atlantic, hundreds of people were still in the water. Some had managed to climb into lifeboats, but many others were simply floating among debris, pieces of wood, and luggage that had been thrown into the sea during the sinking. The water was extremely cold. Even though the disaster occurred relatively close to the coast of Ireland, the Atlantic in that region remained a dangerous environment for anyone who fell into the water without proper protection. Many passengers were wearing life jackets, but those only kept their bodies afloat. The cold continued draining energy and strength with every passing minute. Some survivors managed to cling to overturned lifeboats or fragments of the ship. Others tried to swim toward the few boats that were still intact. Around them, cries for help echoed across the surface of the sea. On land, residents and fishermen near Old Head of Kinsale in southern Ireland had seen the column of smoke and the confusion on the horizon. Small boats quickly began leaving nearby ports to assist with the rescue. Fishing boats, tugboats, and other small vessels were the first to arrive at the scene. When they reached the area where the Lusitania had sunk, they encountered a chaotic sight. Debris scattered everywhere. Lifeboats crowded with survivors. And many people still in the water. The crews of these small vessels began pulling survivors out of the ocean one by one. Some were conscious, shivering from the cold and completely exhausted. Others were unconscious, having spent too long in the freezing water. The rescue continued for hours. Survivors were taken to Queenstown, now known as Cove, an Irish port that quickly became the center of aid for the victims of the disaster. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers waited on the docks as rescue boats arrived carrying people who were injured, in shock, or suffering from hypothermia. When the lists of survivors and victims began to be organized, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Out of nearly 2,000 people on board the Lusitania, 1,198 died. Among the dead were 128 American citizens. This loss of life would have enormous consequences far beyond the maritime disaster itself. The sinking of the Lusitania quickly became an international event that dramatically increased tensions between the United States and Germany. But in that moment at the port of Queenstown, what mattered most to the survivors was the heavy silence left behind by the disappearance of one of the largest ships in the world, and by the warning that many had seen, but chose to ignore. In the days following the disaster, news of the sinking of the Lusitania spread rapidly around the world. Newspapers in Europe and the United States published enormous headlines describing the tragedy. Survivors' stories soon began appearing in interviews, recounting the moments of panic on board, the sudden list of the ship, and the very little time they had to escape. The images and testimonies shocked international public opinion. The fact that a submarine had sunk a large passenger ship full of civilians caused immediate outrage in many countries. In the United States, which had not yet officially entered World War I, the attack triggered a massive wave of anger. President Woodrow Wilson demanded explanations from the German government. Germany, in turn, attempted to justify the attack by claiming that the Lusitania was carrying materials that could support the British war effort. In fact, the ship did carry certain commercial cargo, including ammunition and industrial supplies. Even so, for much of the world, what had happened was seen as a brutal attack on civilians. The sinking of the Lusitania was not the only factor that would eventually lead the United States into the war years later, but it undoubtedly became one of the most significant events of that period. The tragedy was widely used in propaganda campaigns, reinforcing the image of German submarine warfare as a cruel and indiscriminate threat. While governments debated diplomacy and wartime strategy, families across several countries faced the direct impact of the disaster. Hundreds of people never returned home. Many victims' bodies were carried by the currents of the Atlantic and discovered days later along the Irish coast. Local communities took part in funerals and mass burials for those who could never be identified. Over the years, the Lusitania became a lasting symbol of how modern warfare had completely changed the rules of combat at sea. For centuries, naval conflicts had followed relatively clear codes. Merchant ships were usually intercepted, and crews were often given the chance to abandon ship before it was destroyed. But the introduction of submarines changed everything. Attacks could happen without warning. Torpedoes could strike a ship in seconds. And even massive ocean liners, symbols of progress and safety, became vulnerable. Today, the wreck of the Lusitania still rests on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, about 11 miles off the coast of Ireland, near the place where the ship was struck on May 7, 1915. The ship's hull remains broken and partially destroyed after more than a century on the seabed. But the story of the Lusitania is remembered not only because of the sinking itself. It is also remembered for the warning that appeared in a newspaper days before the voyage. A clear warning. A direct alert. A warning that many people saw, but almost no one truly believed would become reality. Stories like this show how the sea and war can transform seemingly small decisions into events that change history. If you enjoy learning about real stories like this, about great ships, maritime tragedies and events that shaped world history, leave a like on this video. It helps the channel continue producing long, detailed documentaries like this one. And if you want to follow more incredible stories about famous shipwrecks, ocean mysteries, and naval events that changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the ocean holds thousands of stories. And many of them are still waiting to be told.